Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am a professor of English at Stanford University. This week's episode will be focusing on Sonny's Blues, one of my favorite short stories of all time by James Baldwin. The story is set in 1950s New York between Harlem and Greenwich Village and turns on the relationship between two brothers 7 years apart. It is told from the older brother's first-person perspective and is a series of memories couched as the difficult relationship between the two brothers. The older brother and narrator remains unnamed throughout. He is an algebra teacher at a school in Harlem, and we see that he has shaped his life around certain choices that give him respectability as a black man and thus some measure of protection from the ambient menace that surrounds the lives of black folk in the period. This is in contrast to his brother, who simply wants to be a jazz pianist and also has a heroin problem. But the contrast between the two brothers is not that straightforward, as we quickly come to find out. The story puts in circulation ideas about the relationship between darkness and light, hearing and listening, black creativity and history that all come together in an exquisite scene at a nightclub where the older brother goes to see Sonny play with the blues band in a club in Greenwich Village at the end of the story. We will see how Baldwin builds up a structure of subtle incremental repetitions of various images and echoes into a mighty crescendo of insight, humanism, and the affirmation of jazz's transcendent value as a bearer and witness of matters pertaining to black life. The story opens with the narrator reading a newspaper story about a heroin bust elsewhere in New York, with the name of his younger brother Sonny among those who were arrested. He and Sonny have not spoken for almost a year following the bust. Earlier in the timeline of the story, the older brother had been in the army and was stationed abroad for a critical part of Sonny's late teenage years. It is in one of the conversations that they have when the older brother is back home on furlough that Sonny divulges the idea of wanting to become a piano jazz player. This does not go down well with the older brother, who responds by expressing his ignorance of the music of Charlie Parker, the greatest jazz musician alive, according to Sonny, and the history of the jazz tradition that Sonny wants to immerse himself in as he trains for his vocation. Sonny is persuaded to go and live with the narrator's wife, Isabel, while he goes back to finish his tour of duty with the army. The only relief Sonny finds in what he sees as a stifling black middle-class home in which he has to live with Isabel, his little nephew and niece, and their grandparents, is that they have a piano in the apartment that he can practice on. He practices on the piano obsessively at all times of day and night, practically driving everyone crazy with his obsession. But it also turns out that he has been skipping school to hang out with other musicians. And when the truth is discovered, he is sternly reprimanded by Isabel's parents. Unfortunately, nasty things are said about his musical obsession, upon which he goes silent for several days and stops playing altogether. Sonny packs out of the apartment, and the next thing they hear is that he has joined the Navy so that he can become a man away from home. The narrator hears about all this from the letters that Isabel writes to him when he's away with the army. The shared experience of the two brothers in the American military does not, however, define a bridging experience for them. Because whereas the older brother chooses the army as a means of shaping the direction he will take as a respectable man, the younger brother's choice of the Navy is a means of escape from the intolerable conditions that he faces at home. When they meet again after both of them return to New York after the war, Sonny is a man and they quarrel almost all the time because to the older brother, Sonny's life sounded just weird and disordered. It is after one of these fights and the failure to make amends that the brothers stop speaking to each other. Thus, it is only after reading of Sonny's arrest and after the death of his own daughter that Sonny's troubles suddenly become real to the older brother, and he reaches out to Sonny in jail. They exchange letters throughout the rest of his time there, and when Sonny leaves jail, he comes to live with his brother and his family in the apartment in Harlem. Earlier in the story, and before he leaves for the army, he recalls an anecdote that their mother shared with him after their father died. Many years previously, when his own father was a young man with his own younger brother who was also, like Sonny, an avid guitar player. The two of them were walking down a hill when the younger brother took off running downhill. He stopped to take a leak behind a tree at the foot of the hill. The narrator's father followed more slowly at a distance. As the younger brother stepped out from behind the tree, a car had just turned the corner and was making its way toward him. It was filled with some white men. The mother continues, "They were all drunk, and when they seen your father's brother, they let out a great whoop and holler, and they aimed the car straight at him. They was having fun. They just wanted to scare the boy, the way they do sometimes, But they was drunk. And I guess the boy, being drunk too and scared, kind of lost his head. By the time he jumped, it was too late. The car ran him over and just continued on." The narrator's father recalled to her that he never in his life seen anything as dark as that road after the lights of that car had gone away. This thematic of light and darkness turns out to be the figuration of the ambient menace that surrounds Black lives. Another variant of this sense of ambient menace is also recalled by the narrator even earlier than the story his mother tells him about his father and his uncle, and relates to the darkening outdoors that adults of his mother's generation see on a Sunday after church as they all sit with their children looking out the window. The silence, the darkness coming, the darkness outside is what the old folks have been talking about. It's what they have come from. It's what they endure. The child knows that they won't talk anymore because if he knows too much about what's happened to them, he'll know too much too soon about what's going to happen to him. Thus, when we get to the story of the death of the narrator's uncle that is told him by his mother, the emblem of darkness is consolidated in the story as the product of the ambient menace of the white world, where a Black life is subject to capricious chance and limited possibilities. And yet, at the same time, the thematic of ambient menace in Sonny's Blues is also counterposed to a sense of rapture that comes from the embodied responses to music by ordinary Black people. The signs of rapture appear in the story at first sporadically and piecemeal, such as with a reference to a barmaid that the narrator sees through a window moving about the bar, washing glasses and singing to the music from a jukebox early on in the story. Later in the story, as Sonny and the narrator are getting to learn more about each other again as brothers after Sonny is released from prison, the narrator watches from a window in the apartment as Sonny walks past a religious revival on the Harlem street below. The revival is being carried out by three sisters, all dressed in black, along with a brother. All they had were their voices and their Bibles and a tambourine. The brother was testifying, and while he testified, two of the sisters stood together, seeming to say amen. And the third sister walked around with a tambourine outstretched and a couple of people dropping coins into it. It is the old ship of Zion, they sang, and the sister with the tambourine kept a steady jangling beat, and it has rescued many a thousand. As the singing filled the air, the watching, listening faces underwent a change, their eyes focusing on something within. The music seemed to soothe a poison out of them, and time seemed ready to fall away from the sullen, belligerent, battered faces, as though they were fleeing back to their first condition while dreaming of their last. As we shall see in our episode next week on Toni Morrison's Jazz, which is also set in Harlem, but in the 1920s, the thematic of jazz is used by writers such as Baldwin and Morrison, not just as a reflection of the specific content of Black people's lives, but also as the means by which moments of epiphany and recognition take shape. Furthermore, both writers execute their works set in Harlem as jazz symphonies, with motifs and echoes being picked up and let drop in a variable set of arrangements that modulate their narratives according to shifting tempos and rhythms. When Sonny entered the apartment, the two brothers briefly refer to the scene on the street they have just both been privy to, but do not really dwell much on it, thus suggesting that the singing and music from the Harlem street acts as a vague soundtrack to the discussion they are having indoors, the subject of which is of grave moment to both of them, but for entirely different reasons. They discuss the reasons why Sonny mixes playing music with taking drugs, something that is of great bafflement to his older brother. What is the relationship between the two? The older brother wonders. It turns out that for Sonny, playing the piano is a form of deeply felt anguish, and the drugs he takes are a way to bear this anguish. But there is more. It is also, as he puts it cryptically, a way to choose his own suffering, since there is no way not to suffer. As he continues to explain to his increasingly bewildered and skeptical brother, but you will try all kinds of ways to keep from drowning in it, to keep on top of it, and to make it seem, well, like you did something all right, and now you are suffering for it, you know? The question of choice that Sonny is trying to explain here is extremely complicated. It implies the exercise of ethical choices in the face of certain damnation. That is to say, he knows he's doomed, so he chooses the form in which this doom will come as a way of standing up against his fate. This choice making is a form of freedom, and it echoes a principle that we saw in our episodes on Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. In both instances, as in the case of Sonny, the protagonists exercise their choices in the full recognition of their futility, but the choice ennobles them as they stand up against their dire fates. This particular conversation between the two brothers is a reprise in miniaturized form of a key feature of the relationship between the two of them, namely that the older brother may hear what his younger brother says, but does not actually listen to him. The difference between hearing and listening is the key reason why the siblings have never got on well, because the older brother always frames Sonny's statements in forms of an ought demand. This is a form of demand that prejudges everything that Sonny says in relation to what he ought to have done or not done in the eyes of his older brother. This does not make for optimal understanding between the two of them. Until, that is, at the very end of the story, when Sonny invites his brother to come and watch him perform at a jazz club in Greenwich Village later that same night. While the story is predominantly set in Harlem, the recourse to Greenwich Village establishes an important set of social contrasts within Sonny's blues. Whereas the Harlem of the story is a place of constraints and full of the ambient menace, as recalled by the narrator, Greenwich Village represents a realm of creativity and the possibility of self-creation. This was actually a meaningful contrast in 1950s New York, when the bohemian settings of the jazz clubs in the village, and indeed in the neighborhood in general, provided attractive venues for the commingling of alternative identities. But it is what happens on the night that the narrator goes to hear his brother play, and his sudden epiphanic recognition, not just about the ultimate salience of his brother's life choices, but of how his music brings together important aspects of Black history that is worthy of note. To understand the sheer beauty and subtlety of Baldwin's writing, I am obliged to read from the jazz club scene at some length. After a faltering first set led by Creole, the band leader, Sonny is stirred in the second set as he plays the piano for the song I Am Blue. This song was first copyrighted by Henry Axe and Grant Clark in 1929, with Eddie Cochrane recording a famous version of the same song in 1957, and Billie Holiday and Ray Charles coming out with their own popular reworkings in 1947 and 1959 respectively. And I Am Blue has been featured in an estimated 42 movies since it was first produced. This then is what we see in the scene at the jazz club. The band leader is called Creole. Then Creole stepped forward to remind them that what they were playing was the blues. He hit something in all of them. He hit something in me, myself, and the music tightened and deepened. Apprehension began to beat the air. Creole began to tell us what the blues were all about. They were not about anything new. He and his boys up there were keeping it new at the risk of destruction, madness, and death in order to find new ways to make us listen. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it always must be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. And this tale, according to that face, that body, those strong hands on those strings, has another aspect in every country and a depth in every generation. Listen, Creole seemed to be saying, listen. Now these are Sonny's blues. He made the little black man on the drums know it, and the bright brown man on the horn. Creole wasn't trying any longer to get Sonny in the water. He was wishing him Godspeed. Then he stepped back very slowly, filling the air with the immense suggestion that Sonny speak for himself. Then they all gathered around Sonny, and Sonny played. Every now and again, one of them seemed to say, Amen. Sonny's fingers filled the air with life, his life. But that life contained many others. And Sonny went all the way back. He really began with the spare, flat statement of the opening phrase of the song. Then he began to make it his. It was very beautiful, because it wasn't hurried and it was no longer a lament. I seemed to hear with what burning he had made it his, with what burning he had yet to make it ours, how we could cease lamenting. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did. Yet, there was no battle in his face now. I heard what he had gone through and would continue to go through until he came to rest in earth. He had made it his, that long line of which we knew only Mama and Daddy. He was giving it back, as everything must be given back, so that passing through death, it can live forever. I saw my mother's face again and felt, for the first time, how the stones of the road she had walked on must have bruised her feet. I saw the moonlit road where my father's brother died, and it brought something else back to me and carried me past it. I saw my little girl again and felt Isabel's tears again, and I felt my own tears begin to rise. And I was yet aware that this was only a moment, that the world waited outside as hungry as a tiger, and that trouble stretched above us longer than the sky. Then it was over. Creole and Sonny let out their breath, both soaking wet and grinning. There was a lot of applause, and some of it was real. In the dark, the girl came by and I asked her to take drinks to the bandstand. There was a long pause while they talked up there in the indigo light. And after a while, I saw the girl put a scotch and milk on top of the piano for Sonny. He didn't seem to notice it, but just before he started playing again, he sipped from it and looked toward me and nodded. Then he put it back on top of the piano. For me then, as they began to play again, it glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling. A number of features of this extraordinary passage are worthy of special attention. While most of the events in Sonny's Blues take place in the daytime, the two memories of events that occur at night that we noticed earlier are both charged with danger. The idea of ambient menace in those instances is an existential condition that is materialized in the incrementally repeated tropes of night and darkness. The scene at the jazz club, however, inverts the standard associations of daylight, night, and darkness that have organized the story up to that point. Now, the darkness in the jazz club is suffused with a luminous indigo light, suggesting a quality to the darkness that is quite different from its previous references in the text. The color indigo has often been used in literary writing to depict wisdom, devotion, and forms of spirituality, so that the presence here involves something out of the ordinary. This is picked up and echoed in the music that Sonny plays, and also in the thoughts that his playing invokes in the mind of his brother while he soaks it all in. Furthermore, the jazz club becomes the space where the full perspectival sensorium of hearing and seeing are accentuated like never before. Not only does the narrator see and hear differently, he experiences these senses as part of an inscape of thoughts and sensations. The word inscape is most associated with the poetry of the 19th century English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, where in poems such as Pied Beauty and When Kingfishers Catch Fire and various others, he explores the idea of how his perceptions of the natural world lend him insights into the complexity of God's creativity through the instantaneous charge of the images of nature that are laid out before him. Thus, inscape is a quality of perceiving the outside not only as conjoined to an internal process of feelings and emotions, but more significantly, of the connection between image and transcendence. This is what we find in the narrator's perceptions of Sonny on stage at the jazz club. The narrator's entire description of Sonny and the bandsmen reads like he's looking at a tableau saturated with sound and pregnant visuality. The inscape that is triggered from this tableau, however, takes him beyond what he is seeing and listening to and into an account of Black history. For what he now sees is that Sonny is calling forth the long history of Black life, starting from that of their own parents and leading into the complex roots of their shared anguish. It reminds the narrator of his own vulnerability and tears when his little girl died. But the entire scene also suggests that Black people are not limited by their traumatic history, but that through the creative power of jazz, and it must also be noted through the example of Baldwin's own exquisite wordsmithing, Black folk are the superb co-creators of new realities for themselves, always refashioned and always renewed as stories that must be told because it is their own stories. The image of the very cup of trembling that closes the scene from the jazz club, and indeed the entire story, is from Isaiah 51:22, where it says, "Thus saith thy Lord, and thy God that pleadeth the causes of his people. Behold, I have taken out of your hand the cup of trembling, even the dregs of the sup of my fury, thou shalt no longer drink again." With this ending, the narrator, and indeed us readers, are delivered into the quiet rapture that comes from a final reckoning with the providence that shines with equanimity on the souls of Black folk, but also because of the inspiration that the scene draws from the Bible on the souls of all folk that see a passage from circumstance to transcendence and from anguish to empathy, be they Jew or New Yorker, African or Londoner, South Asian or Greek, Buenos Airian or Egyptian. Thank you very much. Please remember to check the suggested readings in the episode description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.